Lagos, the city of dreams where the rich lived like kings and queens. Among them were Maureen and Kenneth, a couple who had everything money could buy. Their home was a smart mansion in Banana Island, standing tall like a palace, the floors made of Italian marble, their bedroom designed with a glass ceiling that showed the stars at night, a robotic assistant called Z responding to their every command. They drove the latest cars, Kenneth in his sleek Tesla Model X, Maureen in her limited edition Rolls-Royce Cullinan. Their love story was straight out of a fairy tale, a perfect marriage filled with luxury, adventure, and passion. Kenneth adored Maureen, he called her his queen, kissed her forehead every morning, whispered sweet promises in her ear, took her on romantic vacations across the world, from Paris to Dubai, from Santorini to the Maldives. Maureen was a brilliant fashion entrepreneur, the proud owner of Murrell, a luxury brand worn by celebrities and Lagos socialites. Kenneth, on the other hand, was a tech genius, a billionaire controlling digital banking in Africa. They had it all, the power, the money, the fame, the respect, except for one thing: a child. For 7 years they had waited, hoping, praying, believing that one day they would hear the sound of tiny feet running across their marble floors, but the years passed and the silence remained. At first, Kenneth had been patient, comforting her, telling her that their time would come, that God's timing was perfect. But as time dragged on, patience turned to doubt and doubt turned to distance. The whispers began at family gatherings, Kenneth's mother sighing dramatically and saying how a home without children is just an empty house, his younger sister Tina laughing and making cruel remarks about how Maureen's womb must be just decoration. All this money, all this beauty, yet no child. The words cut Maureen like a knife, but she held on, she believed, she prayed, she hoped. Every doctor said the same thing: nothing is wrong with you, be patient. But patience was a luxury she could no longer afford because Kenneth was changing. At first it was subtle, the way he no longer looked at her with love, the way he avoided eye contact when they were alone, the way he became too busy to have conversations, too distracted to hold her hand. Then it became worse, the kisses stopped, the words of love disappeared, and one night he moved out of their bedroom without a word. Maureen told herself it was just stress, that work was weighing on him, that he still loved her, but deep down she knew she was lying to herself. The love that once burned like a wild flame had died down to cold ashes, and she had no idea how to bring it back. She poured herself into her work, designing new collections, attending high-profile events, smiling for the cameras, acting like everything was fine when inside she was drowning, struggling to breathe, pretending not to notice that her husband was slipping further and further away. Nothing could have prepared her for the moment she walked into the living room that evening and saw Kenneth sitting there with another woman. At first, her mind refused to process what she was seeing: the young woman with flawless dark skin, long silky hair, a soft innocent beauty. But what stood out the most was the way her hands rested on her round belly, a belly that carried the one thing Maureen could never give Kenneth: a child. Something inside her shattered, she stood frozen in the doorway, her heart racing so fast she thought she might collapse, her body numb, her fingers trembling as she tried to understand what was happening, why her husband was sitting so comfortably with this woman, why he was looking at her with warmth, with care, with something that he had not given Maureen in years. The woman turned her head, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile, a smile that carried cruelty, a smile that said, "I have won." Kenneth didn't flinch, he didn't look guilty, he didn't even look ashamed. He just looked at Maureen, his voice flat, emotionless, distant as he spoke. "Maureen, this is Jane. She's carrying my child." The words were like a bullet to her chest. The pain was sharp, cutting deep, stealing the air from her lungs. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She felt like the walls were closing in on her, like the ground was shifting beneath her feet, her perfect life, her perfect marriage, her years of love and sacrifice crumbling before her eyes, reduced to nothing but a cruel joke. The next day the whole of Lagos knew. The whispers spread like wildfire. Kenneth, the billionaire tech mogul, had brought home another woman, a younger woman, a fertile woman, a woman carrying his heir. Social media exploded with gossip. Tabloids printed headlines with her name in bold letters, her face on the front pages, the world calling her the barren wife, the woman who failed at the one thing that mattered most. At parties she felt the stares, heard the hushed voices, people pretending to sympathize but secretly enjoying the scandal, women looking at her with pity, men shaking their heads as if to say, what did she expect? No man waits forever. Even in her own home the insults didn't stop. Tina made sure of that. She walked around with pride, laughing, mocking, reminding Maureen every chance she got that Jane was the true woman of the house now, that a woman's worth was in her ability to bring life into the world, and Maureen had failed. Kenneth no longer spoke to her unless necessary. He stopped coming home some nights, stopped asking how she was, stopped pretending to care. Jane walked freely in their mansion, comfortable, confident, her belly growing bigger with each passing month, her presence a constant reminder of Maureen's shame. The house no longer felt like home. The walls felt like a prison, the air suffocating, the luxury meaningless. What was the point of the designer bags, the expensive jewelry, the world-class vacations when at the end of the day, she was nothing but a discarded woman, unwanted, unloved, forgotten? She had given Kenneth everything, her love, her loyalty, her devotion, and yet it wasn't enough. She wasn't enough. And as the days passed, as the nights grew longer, as the loneliness sank into her bones, one thought kept echoing in her mind, refusing to let her go. What if this wasn't the end? What if she could change her fate? What if there was a way to take back everything they had stolen from her? And so, on a night when the sky was dark and the rain poured heavy over the city, she stepped out into the storm, tears mixing with the raindrops on her face, her heart filled with pain, with anger, with something she couldn't yet name. That was the night everything changed. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last, each one suffocating Maureen more than before. The house that once felt like a palace now felt like a prison. She could hear them laughing, Jane and Tina, their voices ringing through the halls, their happiness mocking her pain. Kenneth barely looked at her anymore, barely spoke, barely acknowledged that she even existed. It was as if she had become a ghost, trapped in a place that was no longer hers. Jane walked around like she owned the mansion, her belly growing bigger, her hands always resting on it like a trophy, a reminder that she had something Maureen never could. She was confident, unbothered, carrying an arrogance that cut deep. She made little comments here and there, soft enough to seem innocent but sharp enough to wound. "Pregnancy is such a blessing, you wouldn't understand," she had said one morning, stretching on the couch, sipping her freshly squeezed orange juice. Tina laughed loudly, looking at Maureen with mock sympathy, shaking her head like she was looking at a lost cause. "She wouldn't understand at all, poor thing," she said, her voice dripping with cruelty. 7 years and nothing to show for it. Maureen clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms, her whole body shaking with the effort to keep herself from screaming, from breaking, from falling apart right there in front of them. But the breaking was already happening. She could feel it, feel herself unraveling, feel the pieces of herself slipping away one by one, lost in the emptiness, in the pain, in the unbearable shame. Kenneth was no longer hers. He had made that clear. He never said it out loud, never had to, but everything he did, everything he didn't do, screamed it. He came home late now, sometimes not at all. His cologne smelled different, his suits carried the faintest trace of a perfume she didn't wear. He had stopped pretending, stopped hiding. He didn't have to. She was nothing but an inconvenience to him now, a mistake he had outgrown. One evening, as she stood by the balcony watching the city lights flicker in the distance, Kenneth walked in with Jane by his side. They were coming from an event, one of those high-profile dinners filled with the richest of the rich, the most powerful of the powerful. She hadn't been invited. He never was anymore. Jane's hand rested on Kenneth's arm, her head tilted slightly towards him, a soft smile on her lips as she whispered something that made him chuckle. It was a sound Maureen hadn't heard in years. Her heart twisted, her chest ached, her throat tightened as she turned away before they could see her, before she could see more. She had seen enough. Later that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she wondered how much more she could take, how much more she was supposed to endure. Was this her fate? To spend the rest of her life watching another woman take her place, live the life that was supposed to be hers, have the child that should have been hers? Was she supposed to just sit there, silent, invisible, while they laughed, while they thrived, while they grew stronger on the pieces of her broken heart? She couldn't. She wouldn't. The pain was too much, the shame too heavy, the betrayal too deep. And so, on a night when the sky was dark and the air was thick with the smell of rain, she walked out of the house, her legs moving without thought, her heart pounding against her ribs, the weight of everything she had lost pressing down on her shoulders. The streets were quiet, the world asleep, but inside her there was no quiet, no peace, no rest. She walked and walked, the rain starting to fall, light at first, then heavier, soaking her clothes, her hair, washing away nothing, healing nothing. Her feet ached, her fingers trembled, but she didn't stop, didn't turn back, didn't care where she was going. And then as she stood beneath the dim glow of a streetlight, she saw her. The woman stepped out from the shadows, old and frail, her skin wrinkled like old paper, her back slightly bent, her clothes worn and tattered. But her eyes burned like fire. Deep, dark, endless, filled with something that wasn't human, something ancient, something dangerous. Maureen took a step back, her breath catching in her throat, but the woman smiled, a slow, knowing smile, her lips curling at the edges. "Shall I take from them what they have stolen from you?" The voice was deep, almost too deep, not a woman's voice, not a man's either, something in between, something unnatural. It sent chills crawling down Maureen's spine, made her skin prickle, made her heartbeat thunder in her ears. She wanted to run, wanted to turn and leave, but the words wrapped around her, held her in place, gripped her like invisible chains. "Shall I take from them what they have stolen from you?" She saw Jane's smile. She heard Tina's laughter. She felt Kenneth's absence. Her hands curled into fists. Her pain roared inside her, wild and angry and unrelenting. She had lost everything, had been reduced to nothing, had been thrown aside like she didn't matter, like she never mattered. But she did. He mattered. She deserved more. She deserved everything. Her lips parted, her voice a whisper, soft but certain, steady, strong. Yes. The woman's eyes flashed. The wind howled. The rain stopped mid-air, the night grew silent, the world held its breath. And then the woman leaned in, her breath warm against Maureen's skin, her words barely a whisper. "It is done." And just like that she was gone. Maureen stood there, heart racing, hands shaking, the air thick with something unseen, something heavy, something real. And as she turned, as she walked back home, she felt it. Something had changed. The morning started with a scream, a high-pitched wail that tore through the house, sending shivers down Maureen's spine. She sat up, her heart pounding as the sound echoed again, louder, filled with agony, filled with something dark, something wrong. She hurried out of bed, her feet cold against the marble floor, her breath uneven as she rushed towards the noise. Jane was on the floor, her hands clutching her belly, her face twisted in unbearable pain, her mouth open in another scream. Kenneth knelt beside her, his hands shaking as he tried to help. His voice desperate, "Jane, talk to me, what's wrong? What's happening?" But Jane couldn't answer, she could only scream. The doctor arrived in minutes, but nothing helped. Jane's screams didn't stop her pain, only grew stronger. Her body twisting like something inside was fighting to get out. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and no one could understand it. The baby was withering inside her, shrinking, pulling away as if something had stolen its very essence. By afternoon the doctor shook his head, his face pale. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "there's nothing we can do." Jane's body went still, silent except for her sobs, except for the look of horror on her face as she realized what had happened. The life inside her was gone. Tina was next. She woke up screaming, her hands over her ears, her face twisted in terror, her eyes darting around the room as if she could see something that wasn't there. Maureen watched from the doorway, unseen, unnoticed. Tina's voice was hoarse, shaking. She's crying, I can hear her, I can hear the baby." Kenneth ran into the room, confused. "What are you talking about? There's no one here." But Tina kept shaking her head, her eyes wide, her breath coming fast. "She's here, she won't stop crying, make her stop, make her stop." But there was nothing to stop, because there was nothing there, at least not to anyone else. Yet Tina continued to hear it, the wailing of a child that never was, the sobs of a baby that would never be, her own guilt, her own shame haunting her with every breath, every moment, every second. She refused to eat, refused to sleep, because the moment she closed her eyes the crying grew louder. Kenneth's fall was slow at first. Small things, his business deals failing, suddenly meetings being cancelled without reason, partners pulling out without warning. Then the money started disappearing. No one knew how, no one understood why. Every account frozen, every investment gone. The man who once controlled wealth with the snap of his fingers now stood empty-handed, powerless, his empire collapsing before his very eyes. His hands trembled as he held his phone, as he read the emails, the messages, the notifications, one after another. All bad, all ruinous. Maureen watched it all, watched the life drain from Kenneth's face, watched as Jane sobbed in the dark, as Tina curled up in her bed, shaking and mumbling to herself. Watched as the house grew silent and cold. No more laughter, no more whispers, just emptiness, just loss. She felt nothing. No regret. No sorrow. They had taken everything from her, and now the universe had balanced the scales. She walked through the house, untouched, unnoticed. No one paid attention to her anymore. No one dared. Her presence was heavy, the air shifted around her, footsteps echoing against the floors. Kenneth's eyes met hers once, just once, and she saw it there. The understanding, the knowledge, the fear. He knew. He didn't know how, he didn't know why, but he knew. Maureen had something to do with this. He knew she was the only one untouched, the only one who stood tall while everything crumbled around them. And then Maureen's belly swelled. It was slow at first, barely noticeable, just a small change, a whisper of something new. Then it grew, her body changing, her hands resting against the curve of her stomach in quiet disbelief. The barren woman was barren no more. The whispers returned, but this time they were different. Hushed, reverent, filled with something deeper, something unspoken. Lagos would never forget what happened. The silence in the house was unbearable. No more laughter, no more voices. Only the weight of something unseen, something dark, something unspoken. Jane no longer left her room, her once beautiful face now hollow, her eyes sunken, her body weak. She refused to speak, refused to eat, refused to acknowledge the world around her. The life she had once carried inside her was gone, stolen from her in a way that no doctor could explain. Her fingers trembled every time she touched her belly, as if she could still feel the emptiness inside her, as if she could still hear the heartbeat that no longer existed. Tina had become a shell of herself. The once bold and sharp-tongued woman now sat in the dark, whispering to herself, rocking back and forth, her hands covering her ears as if trying to block out a sound only she could hear. Her screams had stopped, but the terror remained, etched in her face, her eyes darting to the corners of the room, like something lurked in the shadows, something only she could see. She refused to let anyone touch her, refused to sleep, because every time she closed her eyes, the cries returned, louder, stronger, relentless. Kenneth was not the man he once was. The powerful, the confident, the untouchable, now reduced to a shadow. His company gone, his accounts emptied, the respect he once commanded in Lagos now a forgotten thing. He had fought at first, called his lawyers, called his accountants, demanded answers that never came. He watched as his empire crumbled, day by day, helpless, powerless, trapped in a nightmare he could not wake up from. He barely spoke, barely moved. His suits, which were once perfectly tailored, now hung loose on his thinning frame. His face aged overnight, dark circles beneath his once bright eyes, his hands shaking whenever he reached for his phone, expecting more bad news, expecting another piece of his world to be ripped away from him. Maureen watched them. She sat in the same house they had turned into her prison, the same walls that once held their laughter, their mockery, their cruelty, now suffocating them instead. She was untouched, unnoticed, moving through the spaces like a ghost, her heart steady, her eyes calm. She had no pity, no regret, no sorrow for them. They had taken from her, stolen from her, laughed at her pain, crushed her spirit, and now the universe had taken. Its balance had been restored. Kenneth looked at her now, differently. His once cold gaze now filled with something else, something he never showed her before. Fear. He did not say it out loud, did not ask, did not accuse. But she saw it, in the way he flinched when she passed by, in the way his eyes followed her, careful, cautious, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong move would send him over. She felt his hesitation, felt his unspoken questions. But she gave him nothing. No answers. No explanations. Just silence. And then Maureen's belly grew. At first it was subtle, a small change, a gentle curve. Then it became undeniable, her body changing, shifting. The whispers in Lagos started again. But this time they were different. No longer mocking. No longer cruel. Now they were filled with awe, with confusion, with something close to fear. The barren woman was barren no more. The impossible had happened. Maureen, who had been cast aside, shamed, humiliated, now carried life inside her. The city did not understand, but they watched. They whispered. They waited. Kenneth saw it too. He stared at her across the dinner table, across the halls of the house that was once his jaw tight, his fists clenched. He wanted to ask, he wanted to demand, but he didn't. He couldn't. Because he already knew the answer. Though he would never speak it out loud. Because to say it would mean to accept. It would mean to acknowledge the truth. That something unnatural, something beyond his understanding had happened. And Maureen was at the center of it all. Jane could not look at her. Every time Maureen entered the room she turned away, her body curling into itself, her shoulders shaking as if trying to disappear, as if trying to will herself out of existence. He knew. He understood. In a way no one else did, in a way no words could explain. The life that had been inside her was gone, and now Maureen carried a child. It was not normal. It was not right. It was not fair. But it was real. Tina no longer spoke. Not to anyone. Not even to herself. She sat by the window staring at nothing, lost inside her own mind, trapped in something she could never escape. Her skin pale, her lips cracked, her eyes hollow, the shadows under them deep and dark. She had mocked Maureen once, laughed at her, called her names, spat cruel words in her face. And now she was a woman haunted by voices she could not silence, ghosts she could not escape. She had once believed she had power. But now she knew she had nothing. She was nothing. Kenneth's hands shook every time he reached for his glass, every time he tried to hold on to the last fragments of his former self. But there was nothing left to hold on to, his company, his wealth, his power, all gone. He had nothing left except the woman he had betrayed, the woman he had discarded. But she was no longer his. Maureen no longer belonged to him. She had risen above him, beyond him, untouchable, unreachable, a force he could no longer control. And that terrified him more than anything else. The city would never forget what happened. Lagos would always remember the day the Barren woman became something else, something more, something greater. And the ones who had wronged her fell, one by one, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but dust and silence. The city whispered her name with voices that trembled between fear and awe. Maureen, the woman who was once forgotten, the woman who once walked with her head bowed in shame, now walked with her head high, her belly round with the life that should never have been. She no longer cared for the murmurs, the stares, the hushed conversations that stopped whenever she entered a room. They could talk, they could wonder, they could speculate, but no one dared to question. No one dared to ask. Kenneth sat in the corner of the house that was once his kingdom, his fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey, his once proud shoulders hunched, his eyes hollow. He had lost everything, his company, his fortune, his respect. Even the women who had stood beside him had nothing left. Jane was a ghost of herself, barely eating, barely speaking, her once glowing skin now dull, her body frail. She moved through the house like a shadow, afraid of something she could not name, something that weighed on her chest and squeezed her breath from her lungs. She avoided Maureen, refused to look at her, refused to acknowledge her, because to do so would mean to accept that what had happened to her had never been natural. Tina had left. No one saw her go. One morning she simply wasn't there anymore. The room where she had spent her days rocking, whispering, covering her ears was empty, her things untouched, the door left slightly open as if she had slipped into the night, never looking back. The last sounds that had come from her room had been a quiet sob, a broken whimper, a whisper of regret. Kenneth could feel something inside him unraveling. He had always been a man of logic, of power, of control. But there was nothing logical about what had happened to him. Nothing rational, nothing that could be explained. His business had not just collapsed, it had been erased. His accounts had not just been emptied, they had vanished. His partners no longer answered his calls. His investments crumbled without reason. One day he was one of the most powerful men in Lagos, and the next he was nothing. A forgotten name, a story told in hushed voices, a cautionary tale for men who believed they were untouchable. He wanted to ask her. He wanted to know if she had done this, if she had wished for his ruin, if she had cursed him in the way only old stories warned about. But he could not bring himself to say the words because, deep down, he already knew. Maureen did not need to say it. She did not need to confirm it. He saw it in her eyes, in the way she looked at him, not with hatred, not with revenge, but with something far worse. Indifference. She no longer cared about him. He could disappear, he could beg, he could break, but it would mean nothing to her. He had once held her heart in his hands and crushed it without mercy. And now she was untouchable. The child inside her grew, and with every passing day, Lagos spoke of her with more fear than admiration. It was not natural, they whispered. It was not possible. Yet there she was, glowing, powerful, untouchable. They no longer mocked her, no longer called her names, no longer pitied her. Now they feared her. Now they bowed their heads when she passed. Now they treated her as something greater than themselves. Kenneth tried to hold on to the last piece of himself. He tried to pretend that he was still a man of power, a man who could control his fate. But every attempt was met with failure. Every grasp for redemption was met with emptiness. He was no longer in control. He was no longer the man he once was. And he knew it. And worse, Maureen knew it too. One night he found her standing by the large window of their home, her hands resting gently on her belly, her face calm, the moonlight casting a soft glow around her. He swallowed hard, his voice rough from nights of drinking, from days of silence. Maureen. She didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge him right away, as if he was nothing more than the wind passing through the room. Then after a long pause she spoke, her voice soft yet strong, steady yet distant. Yes. Kenneth felt his throat tighten, felt the weight of everything he had done, everything he had lost, pressing against his chest. I'm sorry. The words felt small, empty, meaningless, even to him. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes unreadable, her expression blank. She studied him for a moment. Then a small, sad smile touched her lips. You're only sorry because you lost everything. He wanted to deny it, wanted to tell her that it wasn't true. But he couldn't. Because deep down he knew she was right. She turned away again, looking out at the city that had once been hers and his together, but now belonged to her alone. Kenneth stared at her. The woman he had once loved, the woman he had betrayed, the woman who had become something he could no longer reach. He wanted to touch her, to fall to his knees, to beg. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Nothing he said, nothing he did would change what had already been set in motion. The city would never forget what had happened. The whispers would never fade. The fear would never die. And Kenneth would forever be the man who lost everything to the woman he thought he could break, but who had instead become more powerful than he could ever imagine.